Last year I made a tier list for the iPhone, and I annoyed pretty much everyone with my selection, but luckily for you, my taste in iPods is less radical. So, let's rank the best music player ever made from A tier to Zune tier. No wait, that's the same thing. From A tier to F tier, starting with the first generation iPod. Ah yes, the first iPod. This thing was an absolute chunker. It was so big that there was a full-size FireWire port on top of the device for charging and for transferring songs. And transferring songs, it could. Well, FireWire was fast, much faster than USB 1 of the day, but even USB 2 iPods that would come years later were still slower than this first generation iPod when transferring music from your computer. It was really cool. But what made the iPod was iPod OS. It was basically just a reskinned version of Bono Player, a company that Apple had purchased about a year prior. This whole product was developed in less than 8 months. And the fact that the general design and the OS stayed effectively unchanged until 2014 when Apple killed off non-touch iPods is frankly amazing. That's 13 years. Proof that they pretty much got it right. Now, these buttons around the perimeter would transform into the click wheel, but this layout stayed the same throughout the entire run of the iPod, and everyone would try to copy Apple afterwards. It was the best input method, frankly, until touch came around. This thing was built like a tank, and yet it was svelte compared to something like the Creative Nomad, which was its only comparison. There was tons of storage for the era, 5 gigabytes thanks to a really cool hard drive, but it did have 4 megabytes of flash built in, so it could actually have skip protection, which, yes, was a thing with those early hard drives. It used iTunes, which was new but incredibly refined jukebox software. There was no store. You could only rip your CDs and or pirate music from Napster, but it was a thing. And so, yeah, the first iPod. I mean, this thing is S tier, right? Well, it was $400, which is pretty expensive, and it was also Mac only. But it paved the way for future S tier iPods. So I'm going to have to give the first gen an A tier. I know that's going to make people mad, but you got to do what you got to do. The second generation iPod, this is where things get interesting, right? Not quite. This basically was a really, really tiny refresh to the original iPod that came less than a year after the iPods released. The original iPod had a wheel. This wheel right here literally spun physically on the original iPod. And on the second gen, they moved to a capacitive touch-sensitive wheel for improved reliability, and they also added a bunch of other things that made it just feel a little more premium. There was a port cover over the FireWire port, which the original did not have. Importantly, they added Windows compatibility, but they did not bring iTunes to Windows, which was the most compelling part of the iPod, even in the early days. You could only use it through Music Match, and also almost no Windows computers had FireWire, so yeah, I guess they made an effort to bring it to Windows, but not really a good enough of an effort. It did come in 10 and 20 gig capacities, which was a lot larger than the original iPod, and the price was lowered from $400 to $299. It was a good iPod, but not different enough from the first gen to, frankly, in my book, get anything more than a C tier. Boom. Now we're cooking with fire. The third generation iPod. Now I'm a little biased towards this model because this was the first iPod I ever used. My dad bought one, a 30 gig model at CompUSA. Remember that store? And I still have this iPod today with the box. But bias be darned, this was an incredible iPod and I would have loved it even if I didn't have one. But I do, and I really like it. Visually, it's fantastic. The buttons moved from around the perimeter of the wheel to the top in a row. It was the only iPod to break away from this mold. All of these buttons were capacitive. They're touch sensitive, but they worked so well. And they lit up orange and looked so freaking cool in the dark. This is the iPod that also introduced the 30-pin dock connector, which became a staple on iPods and iPhones for years to come. And while it could only charge via FireWire, it did come with a USB cable in the box, and it could sync over USB, which was huge for Windows users that, ta-da, not only got USB support, but also iTunes. In 2003, the year this iPod launched, we also got the iTunes Store, which made it the best way to legally acquire music, 99 cents per single, and it was a change that, honestly, we forget, but it upended the entire recording industry, because up until then, you could maybe get singles on a promotional CD, but generally you were buying the entire album. This came out, 99-cent songs, you only buy the songs you like. Wow, it was cool. This was also the first iPod that sounded good. And it didn't just sound good, but it sounded great. It had 2 DACs, 2 ADCs, along with an integrated headphone driver. There was programmable sample rates, there was an ADC high-pass filter, and audio data interfaces. If you don't know what that means, it doesn't matter. Point in case, it still sounds amazing today and is a fantastic little iPod. It also supported AAC, which allowed for better sounding, more compact audio files. The battery life, okay, that did take a hit. It dropped from 10 hours to 8 hours, but it was significantly smaller and thinner, which I think made it worth the trade-off. This is an easy S-tier iPod. Probably my favorite iPod ever in history. Doesn't it look good there? Ah yes, the iPod mini, Apple's first breakthrough iPod for a few reasons. Well, for one, it first debuted the click wheel. It would be used in pretty much all iPods, as you can see, for the next 10 years. It could scroll through lists capacitively, but then when you wanted to enact on something, you would just depress and tilt the entire wheel to access those action buttons. This thing was crazy small for the time, thinner than a deck of cards, but it was still hard drive based, and that hard drive carried 4 gigs of storage. And when compared to similarly kind of small devices like this, they were all flash-based, which on the flip side sounds futuristic, but on the realistic side was problematic because not only were they expensive, but you had to buy the memory, and the flash storage of the era was like 256 megs, 128 megs. This was 4 gigs. It was a lot. And as if that wasn't enough, it was priced at $249. Apple was out for blood. There was not a similarly capacious MP3 player on the market of the same size and price. It came in 4 colors, the first for an iPod, and my little brother got one. He got an iPod before me. So my heart wants to give it an F tier because that sucks for me, but honestly, this is an A tier iPod for sure. Real good. Yeah, that's a good looking iPod. Love it in green too. All right, next. The iPod, wait, what? What the frick is this? Oh, right. This is failed Republican presidential candidate Carly Fiorina holding up an iPod as CEO of Hewlett-Packard. Why the frick was she holding a blue iPod? Well, HP and Apple partnered up because HP wanted to be cool and sell the iPod, and in exchange, Apple said, all right, but you have to ship iTunes on every single one of your computers. And HP was like, all right. Now, this blue HP iPod never happened, but there was a 4th gen iPod, an iPod mini, an iPod Photo, and an iPod Shuffle that all had HP variants. Now, they were identical. There was no special colors. It was just an ugly HP logo engraved onto the back of the devices. But HP did sell enough of them that it made up about 5% of iPod sales for Apple, and it massively increased iTunes penetration on the market. But what's not cool is that Apple would not service them at their stores since they were not Apple products, they were HP products. If your iPod that was HP branded broke, you would have to mail it to an HP service center, despite this hardware being identical to the other iPods. This is an instant F tier, like not even... No, you know what? It's worse than F tier. We're just gonna put it right there. Awful iPod. The 4th gen iPod. This is a good iPod. They basically took the good of the 3rd gen, they took the click wheel from the iPod mini, they stuck them together, increased the base model storage, and boom, done. But they did start to cheap out on stuff, and they stopped including the case, the dock. They used to have these little dock connector covers too. That was gone. There was no remote. You got nothing. And you know what? That's not cool, man. They didn't do enough, and they took away too much of the old cool stuff. It's not a bad iPod, but it was just kind of, not good enough. D tier. No. This is a 4th generation monochrome iPod for $50 more money, and in exchange, you get Bono's signature and advertisement scribbled on the back. But don't worry, because that $50 did go a little bit further. You got a $50 discount if you decided to torture yourself with the entire U2 box set discography. Black and red is not a cool combo, I'm sorry Marquez, and U2 is not a cool band. F tier. Now, the iPod Photo is also considered a 4th generation iPod, but it came out several months later and it had a color display, so I almost consider it a secondary generation. Now, you may think, okay, color display, all of the good about the iPod, that gives it an A tier, right? Hold on, because all you could do on this iPod Photo is look at photos and at 220 by 176 pixels, which for the day wasn't that bad, but the display itself wasn't great, Chief. To make matters worse, Apple wanted $500 for the privilege of seeing color. This is bad as is, but considering that less than a year later, a new iPod would come out with a better display, video playback capability, a smaller case size, and a $200 lower price tag, yeah, pretty much anyone that bought one of these got screwed, and that's gonna have to make it an E tier for me. It's not as bad as the Bono box. Ah yes, the 2nd generation Mini. Let me put this next to the 1st generation so you can see the difference. So the buttons, they're green now. That's kind of literally what they did. They made the base storage a little bit better. They dropped the price $50. They did add more vibrant colors, but they also stopped getting rid of most of the accessories that came with the device. It was a good iPod, but a really lazy update. I'm gonna have to give it a C tier. What is not a C tier is the 1st generation iPod Shuffle. I won this iPod in an arcade machine, so that automatically makes it fantastic. Yeah, sure, there's no display, and playing songs on shuffle was kind of gimmicky, but it was so 2005. I mean, this was during the era of 99-cent singles. We weren't listening to albums anymore. And even today, this thing feels absolutely tiny. It's like a thick stick of gum. And that's thanks to flash storage. It's the first iPod that shipped with flash. The bottom cap had a cute lanyard accessory that you could hang around your neck, but more importantly, when you pulled the cap off, it revealed a built-in USB-A connector that you could just plug directly into your computer to sync and charge. Not only that, but you could even use it as a flash drive at a time when those were quite expensive. This thing is bloody brilliant. It was the first iPod available under $100, even though that model had a measly 512 gigs of storage. And also, fun fact, the 1st generation Shuffle is widely considered the best sounding iPod ever made. It has an incredible Sigma Tel DAC that is lusciously warm. The 1st Shuffle is the best Shuffle and flexes S-tier muscles, for sure. Boom. Looks good there. The 1st generation Nano. This was my first iPod ever. Can you believe it? I got it Christmas 2005, and boy, did I love it. Now, there's not many Steve Jobs moments more iconic than him talking about how the iPod Mini is the best-selling iPod they've ever made, but that they're going to kill it off anyways for something better and something newer. And then he does the bit where he points to his watch pocket in his jeans and says, "Have you ever wondered what this pocket is for?" And then he pulls out the Nano. Yeah, well, that was a great demo because 12-year-old me thought it was freaking insane that a music player could be 4 millimeters thick. Even today, that's bananas. That's half the thickness of the thinnest iPhone ever. It had all flash storage, a color display, and a bottom-mounted headphone jack that made this one of 2 devices that really started the iPod revolution. I mean, in 2005 alone, they shipped 5 times as many iPods as every year prior to that combined. Everyone wanted an iPod, and that was much in part thanks to the Nano. I don't care that the screen got scratched by just looking at it. This is an S-tier iPod. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, baby. Okay, I have a confession to make. I really liked my iPod Nano, but most of my friends had gotten the 5th generation iPod for Christmas, and I will admit that I was jealous that they were watching The Office and other TV shows that I could not watch because the Nano did not have video playback. No other iPod did prior to this bad boy. It offered a larger, brighter display in a thinner, more premium chassis than the iPod Photo at almost half the cost of its predecessor. I can't believe that we thought watching video on a 2.5-inch screen was awesome, but we did. It was a thing we did, and I wanted the video so bad, that I asked my parents for one for my 13th birthday, even though that was only 4 months after having gotten my Nano, and they agreed. They gave it to me, but on the condition that I passed my Nano down to my brother to replace his old iPod Mini. It seemed like a fair trade at the time. And it was really this iPod and the iPod Nano that were the first to come in black. Well, except for this freaking Bono box, and we're done with this, right? I got the black one, but wait, what? No, there's another one? Stop! Get off of here! Frick you too! Okay, yeah, so anyway, S tier. Okay, this one is kind of cheating. It's not an iPod, but it's amazing because it was a blunder that didn't sell despite being pretty decent. Jobs was really excited about the iPod Hi-Fi, but the market positioning was just all wrong. The marketing was lousy and it didn't sell at all. Check out my video I did on this a couple years ago, or I'll give you the same grade that I'm giving the iPod Hi-Fi. D tier. Already time for 2nd Gen Nano? Yep. It took on the colored aluminum casing of the iPod mini that it replaced. The display was brighter, the storage was bumped, and new software features like search and gapless playback arrived. It was also the first product red model that Apple ever shipped, and it was so popular, this red color, that they ended up bringing it back to the higher capacity model as well. It also fixed, in my opinion, the biggest blight of the 1st generation Nano, which was the scratchable surface and build quality, but really didn't really do much anything else. So this is a B tier iPod. The 2nd generation Shuffle. It did lose the amazing DAC of the 1st gen, but it also lost look at this thing. This is not to scale, but it lost like 80% of its size. It was so small that it had to be charged and synced via the headphone jack, which, yeah, was dreadfully slow. You could also use it as an external USB drive like the 1st generation, but because of the headphone jack and cable, it wasn't quite as convenient. And the 2nd gen Shuffle was really tiny and had a built-in clip for fitness, so yeah, I'd give it a B tier, but wait till you hear the price. $49. $49 freaking dollars for the 1 gig model and $69 for the 2 gig model. $50 for an iPod. For that reason alone, the Shuffle 2 is A tier. Ah, here's something I recognize, the 2007 iTouch. I can't even say it jokingly. Every time someone said iTouch, even in the past, Steve Jobs is retroactively rolling in his grave. Here's the thing. It's not called the iTouch. It's never been called the iTouch. Say that out loud. iTouch. That sounds gross. But I'm certainly not going to touch this because even though it only came out 3 months after the iPhone and shared the same processor, it was not like the iPhone. You see, the iPhone had an iPod app. And this didn't, because, well, it was an iPod. So the music and the videos, those were all separated. But I think the real reason is because look at this screen. There's basically nothing on here. There's no Stocks app, there's no maps, there's no notes, there's no weather, there's no camera, there's no email. I mean, I get the camera, but all of those other things, you didn't need cellular. You could have done that on Wi-Fi. There was no email on this. Why? Now, there was a calendar app, ooh, big deal, but you couldn't actually even add anything to the calendar. You could only view what you had added from your computer or from your phone. What? Now, it did ship with YouTube and Safari, which I think bumps its grade up, but YouTube was certainly in its infancy. It was mostly little short cat videos, and the mobile browser, while impressive, was limited in a world where Flash was still so dominant. With that said, it was the first iPod that could download songs wirelessly from iTunes, though it couldn't sync wirelessly. It had options for closed captioned video. It had video progress retention, so you could pause a movie, exit the app, come back later, and says, do you want to keep watching? That was nice. And other settings that were not present on classic iPods. Additionally, the DAC present was much better than the DAC on the iPhone, but the screen was not. It was a dim TN panel that was much worse than the original iPhones. With just 16 gigs of storage and its $400 price point, this thing was a tough pill to swallow upon release. It was a technological wonder and much beloved, and those apps along with the App Store did come later, so it's probably deserving of A tier, except it did age really poorly due to its processor, and many touches would never see later versions anyways because Apple charged $10 to $20 for each software update. So for that, I'm gonna have to give it a B tier. Yes, I know it was for accounting reasons. That doesn't matter. That's not cool. Don't charge for software, especially when it was free on the iPhone. Okay, what's next? The Fat Nano. I love Fat Nano. The 3rd generation Nano is probably my favorite Nano ever. This is a very polarizing design. You either love it or you hate it. And if you hate it, you're wrong. Because the Nano 3rd gen was awesome for a few reasons. Look how tiny the click wheel is. It's just minuscule. But even though it was small, it was still really usable. The wheel was made stubby in order to make room for a much larger horizontal display, not only for a better view of the iPod's UI, but also for video playback, which was the first for the Nano line. It had a 2-inch screen, which was very small for video, but it had the same resolution as the larger 2.5-inch iPods, which made it the most pixel-dense iPod ever at 200 ppi. That was even higher than the brand new iPod Touch. It also had this new cool split screen navigation menu where you could navigate on the left side, but then see album art and progress on the right side. It was very beautiful. And it also had the iPod Touch's cover flow feature. Okay, with all that said, it didn't have the greatest DAC, and the small SSDs were not really conducive to video storage. You could get 1 or maybe 2 movies on there, and that's about it. So even though my heart says S tier because I love this thing, it's probably a B tier iPod, but I still love it. And now we get to the best iteration of the original iPod because it's the last hard drive based iPod Apple ever made, and they nailed it. The Classic takes all of the good of the Fat Nano's new UI in addition to the best screen ever on an iPod. It puts everything in this really handsome all metal enclosure and offers huge capacities of 80 and 160 gigs. Now, this is where we get a little confusing here because this is a single icon, okay? But it's actually 2 generations of iPod. The 6th gen, which came out in 2007, the 80 and 160 gig storage capacities, those actually had a pretty terrible DAC, one of the worst that Apple had used in years. You didn't want that one. But a year later, the 7th generation came out and it replaced both the 80 and the 160 gig models with one size 120 gigabytes. And it's this one. Not only is the DAC excellent, but the headphone was also great for the first time ever for using high impedance headphones. And I don't know if you've noticed, this thing is thin. It was thinner than any previous hard drive based iPod, including the 6th generation Classic. There was a fat Classic and a thin Classic. The thin is the one you want. This was the perfect send off to the Classic iPod and is absolutely, unquestionably S tier. Okay, Nano 4. Yeah, nanochromatic. This thing went back to vertical, had a lot of colors. There was an accelerometer for a couple of games and a terrible shake to shuffle gimmick. There was a really, really bad DAC. It shipped with the genius auto playlist feature that was frankly dumb. And it still played video, but horizontally and awkwardly. I do not like this Nano. D tier. Okay, the 2nd gen Touch. This thing shipped with a slightly faster processor than the 1st gen. Not much, but a little. It had a redesign that added much more scratchable corners. Thanks, Apple. But check out the home screen. All those apps that were missing, they're here now, which is great. And it also has the App Store, which should basically probably auto S tier any iPod that has it, but I cannot. For the 2nd generation Touch dropped the great DAC that shipped in the original. The display was still crappy, and while it did eventually get 2 years of software updates, including iOS 4, which the original Touch never did, it didn't get any of the good features of iOS 4 because the processor was crap. There was no home screen wallpapers, there was no multitasking, there was no game center, and more. It was good on day one, but had extraordinarily poor longevity. D tier. They literally made an iPod with no buttons. Oh my gosh. The DAC on this was not good. It didn't have good sound quality. There were no buttons. So unlike previous shuffles, you had to use Apple compatible headphones or silly little adapters that you would plug into the iPod to add buttons and then plug your real headphones into. What? It didn't offer USB mass storage support, which the prior 2 shuffles had offered, and it was $30 more expensive than the prior model. This is an easy F tier, except for the fact that I really like it. It did offer voiceover, which would tell you what song you were listening to, which was kind of nice. And it did also offer multi-playlist support, which was the first for a shuffle. And yeah, it's so ridiculous that you kind of can't look at it and not smile. It's E tier because it sucks, but it's ours. The 5th generation Nano is the end of an era because it's the last iPod to ever ship with a click wheel. Its headlining feature was shooting video. Yeah, and he did a really bad job at it. The camera was VGA, it was terrible, and oh, by the way, it couldn't shoot photos. I'm not kidding, only video. But they did add a bunch of other things that iPod users had been asking for years. It had a lower price point of $150 and $200 for 8 and 16 gigs respectively, and it got features like an FM radio with tagging, and you could even pause and then resume the radio functionality. It would record a little bit and you could resume playback, which was great. It had a built-in pedometer for Nike Plus support. There was a speaker. It had an onboard microphone for voice recording. This is probably the best Nano ever made, even though it came late in the lineup and is often forgotten. This is certainly an A-tier Nano. Okay, the 3rd gen Touch actually was a pretty big deal because there was a huge leap in performance graphically thanks to taking some of the iPhone 3GS's internals. This made it way better for playing games. There was also a much improved oleophobic coating for fingerprint management, and it was the first iPod to get free updates. But it still lacked a camera, and the DAC wasn't very good. It was better than the other 2 previous iPod Touches, but it didn't have the lasting permanence, or at least the impact that the original Touch had when it launched. It also only got 2 years of limited support. There were no updates after 2 years. It never got Siri, which was like one of the major features for iOS 5. So I think we can only do C tier for this one. It was better, but still not good. Ah yes, the apology shuffle. As you can see, Apple added back buttons, but not just any buttons, the largest buttons of any shuffle to date. If that's not a statement of regret, well, I don't really know what is. Despite adding large buttons back, it's still the 2nd smallest shuffle ever. It's tiny. Now, it's not as small as that, because look at that freaking thing. But it was really, really small. And not only did they add back buttons, but they added back a DAC that actually sounded good. This thing was an excellent sounding music player, especially considering its size. The size was not the only thing that got bigger, but yes, it was, because the price got smaller. It went from $80 down to that $50 price point that was kind of key to the Shuffle success. And Apple kept this 4th gen Shuffle in the lineup for 7 years. But they did update it fairly frequently with updates and a ton of new colors. It's not as good as the 1st gen, but it's still a really great Shuffle. It's gonna have to be A tier for me. The 4th gen Touch was the first great iPod Touch, in my opinion. It added front and rear cameras for the first time, which obviously brought with it FaceTime support. It also included a really fantastic Retina display, basically the same you were going to get on your iPhone, and it added the same A4 SoC that was found in the current generation iPhone 4. Spec for spec, this thing was basically identical, just sans phone components. It had higher capacity storage options than the previous model, and it came in black and white. It is the single biggest generational leap for the Touch, in my opinion, but it's still not going to be S tier for me because it only got 2 years of software updates. Here's the thing. Apple said that it had performance issues with iOS 7 testing, so they never brought iOS 7 to this device. But I call bupkis on that because it had the same display and the same SoC as the iPhone 4. And that device got iOS 7. So I can't give it S tier, but I am absolutely going to give it A tier. It was a really, really good Touch. Speaking of Touch, the 6th gen Nano. I love the 6th gen Nano, and I know a lot of people don't, but I think that's because they're not thinking of it like it should be thought of. It's like a fancy shuffle. Its size was absolutely tiny. It was the only Nano to have a built-in clip, and it moved to a touchscreen card-style UI. It was a lot less efficient than the click wheel that it had replaced, but it did work, and it even had the ability to display a bunch of different clock faces, which meant that a bunch of third-party case makers came out and made watch straps for this thing so that you could strap an iPod to your wrist. I think it was in many ways a hat tip and practical exercise in Apple Watch development. It was delightful, but frankly, it was not a very good Nano. To get to its small size, it dropped the speakers, the camera, the built-in microphone, video playback. It also packed a smaller battery with less playback time, and the DAC also sucked. So yeah, as a Nano, not great. As a Shuffle, A tier, easily. But this thing was $150 and a Nano successor, and so because of that, I'm gonna have to give it C tier. But I still love it. The 5th gen Touch came after a 2-year hiatus. It was clear the iPhone was a runaway success, maybe even more than Apple anticipated, and the smartphone was rapidly becoming something for everyone, which kind of ruined the iPod Touch lineup. But the Touch 5 did still have some effort put into it. Now, unlike the prior generation Touch, which had, as we discussed, SoC parity with the iPhone, the Touch 5 did not. It was using the 1-year-old A5. But it did upgrade the cameras and added 1080p video recording, which was nice, and it also got the better 4-inch display that was found in the iPhone 5. This also meant that it was the first Touch to ship with Lightning. It came in a bunch of fun colors, and there was a button on the back that could be pressed, and a loop could be snapped into this kind of weird button accessory thing. I mean, who needed a wrist strap for their iPod? I don't really know. Still, it was cute. It was something. There was effort. The problem was price. At $300 starting price point, there were a lot of tablets, including the mere $30 more expensive iPad mini that offered a better value for kids who were, let's be honest, the target market at this point for the iPod Touch. I'm gonna have to give this a C tier. The last gen Nano was a confused one. They took a step back from the radical watch Nano to a more iPod Touch-like design. I mean, look, there's a home button and all. But they failed to create something compelling with this otherwise really good blueprint. I mean, it looked like iOS, but it didn't run iOS, and subsequently, it felt lost. It was less feature complete than the emaciated Zune HD that had shipped 2 years prior. There were no apps. There was no camcorder, there was no microphone, there was no calendar, no notes, no alarms, no context, and even the games that had been offered on the 5th generation Nano years prior. There was a larger display, which was nice, and it did bring back video playback. Audio could even be played wirelessly over Bluetooth, but the display was remarkably poor, not just for the era, but even compared to past Nanos, like, again, the 5th gen. Its pitch? Well, its pitch was, hey, this is the thinnest iPod ever. Big whoop. It was too expensive for what it was, and it's sadly a bitter end to the traditional iPod. It's probably a D tier or an E tier, but honestly, this was so low of an effort for the last product of an era that I have to give it an F tier. It was just bad. What else can we see Apple not care about? The iPod Touch. The iPod Touch 6th generation was the first update in 2.5 years, but it did bring the current gen A8 SoC that was found in the iPhone 6, and performance was actually even better than the iPhone because it had the older, smaller 4-inch screen. But compared to the new iPhones, I mean, the old display size and resolution just felt disappointing, and battery life is quite poor too. Now, what wasn't disappointing was the camera, which was actually pretty close in performance to the iPhone 6, the flagship device at the time. Now, it did ditch the wrist loop accessories, and there was no Touch ID. See, that's just a regular home button. But it did drop the price down to $199, and it got 4 years of software support. And technically, because of a security patch that was released just a few months ago, it got 8 years of support. But not actually. Okay, all in all, this was actually a really good touch, even if it was a boring one, and I think it earns B tier. We're to the end with the 7th gen Touch. Best for last, right? This thing came out 4 years after the 6th gen Touch, not that long ago, 2019, and it shipped with an A10 Fusion chip, which was a pretty powerful iPad chip, but remember, that chip was already 3 years old on release, and nothing else changed at all. Nothing. Zero. It had the same iPhone 6 camera. It had the same old 4-inch display. It had the same lousy battery life. There was no effort at all. They just swapped the chip and were like, meh. And the mere 3 years of updates reflect that. This thing was most certainly a play for businesses and education who still relied on them, but that was pretty much it. Apple had stopped caring about the iPod years before, and it's a shame that I've got to do it, but the last iPod ever, the 7th generation iPod Touch, it's F tier. Easy. So there you have it. 20 years of iPods put into a list. We had some extreme highs, but also some extreme lows. And perhaps unsurprisingly, but depressingly, those lows came near the end of the iPod's life, and it exited with a whimper rather than a roar. But what's your favorite iPod? Do you think my list is nutties? Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay snazzy.